Hey there and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be taking you on a walk down memory lane and sharing some more of my childhood food memories. My Nana and Grandad's house was always filled with the sweet smells and the delicious aromas of amazing food, and it was always the highlight of my week whenever I was there to enjoy it. So join me as I share these timeless dishes and a little bit about my history that has a very special place in my heart. My brother and I would go and visit my grandparents all the time. When we were really little, we would go every weekend or every other weekend. And then as we got older, we would visit during the school holidays. And if you don't know anything about British schools, there are quite a few different holidays throughout the year because we don't have a huge summer holiday like a lot of other countries. You have 6 weeks in the summer, and then you have 2 weeks for Christmas and 2 weeks for Easter. Those are the big ones. And then in between each of those, and that period at school we would call a term, you would have 1 week in the middle that we would call a half term because it's the half term holiday. And we would go basically there every single time and spend loads of time there. And in the summer, we would spend a couple of weeks with them, which was always amazing. My Nana, as we called her, was a fantastic cook. Very traditional, very much meat and veg and potatoes and all that kind of stuff. But she was brilliant at cooking. She showed me loads of stuff that she used to do. And she would always make a fresh meal for my granddad when he came back from work. I always remember when he was still working before he retired, he owned his own box making factory that was started by his great granddad. So it was a long running family business. And he would come home every lunchtime, he would stick on the news, he would read his newspaper, and he would sit there and wait for the meal to be made. The big full meal would actually be at lunchtime rather than in the evening, whereas in most households it's usually in the evening. The funny thing is, they were very regimented, very routine driven, and the reason I think it's so funny and the reason I actually wanted to talk about it today is because they actually had a fixed menu. Basically, I knew whichever day I visited what we would be eating. And it sounds really funny, but they literally had the same thing every single week. And then over time, it slightly changed where maybe my nan decided that one of the dishes was too much effort, or because it was only her and my granddad a lot of the time, they would cook something a little bit simpler. But for the majority of my childhood, we basically had the same thing every day. So if we arrived on a Monday, we knew exactly what we were going to have. So I thought I'd just run through the menu and just explain what we had. I'm going to be focusing on the main meals because the other stuff was the typical cereal for breakfast and maybe sandwiches or something like that. But the main meal was always a big event. It was always really full of food and really, really delicious. I'm going to start with Sunday, although I'm not one of the people that likes to think of Sunday as the start of the week. In their food menu, it basically was. So Sunday was the traditional roast dinner with a roasted piece of meat, whatever that might be, with roast potatoes, with lots of greens. And when I say greens, I mean green vegetables. That's how we would normally define them. And loads of other stuff. Often my nan would get the meat and she would put it in the oven in the morning, and then we would go out to the park, and there was a very big local park we would go and play in, and there was also a museum in that park we would visit every single time we were there, and we must have been there thousands of times over the course of our childhood. And while we were there and we were running around and maybe having an ice cream, the meat was slowly cooking, ready for lunchtime. And I distinctly remember that they used to serve it out in serving dishes, especially when I was very little. They would actually do the traditional thing where they had big ceramic serving dishes for all of the different ingredients or sides or parts of the meal. So they would have one huge one for potatoes. If they did some broccoli, for example, they would have another one which had all of that in it. Then my granddad would carve the meat, and that would be on a big platter, which is basically a huge plate. And the table would be set, and we'd have a tablecloth, and you'd have placemats, which were like wooden mats with a picture usually printed on the front, and you'd put them on your place setting where you would sit and have your plate, and then down the center you would have a long line of them, and that was usually mine and my brother's job. We would actually have to set the table, so we'd go and get the cutlery and we'd put all of that out and we'd get everything ready with the salt and the pepper and any sauces we might have. So if we were having pork, we'd have to get the applesauce, and if it was beef, we'd get horseradish, even though it was only my granddad who ever had horseradish. And then on the table, we also had like a big jug of gravy and all that stuff. So it was always a really big event, and we could always help ourselves, and we had seconds and thirds and stuff like that. And it was always meals like that I remember my granddad teaching us really bad habits while we were eating. Stuff like licking his knife. And he would literally always say, "Do what I say, not what I do." And then he would lick his knife. And then if we did it, then we'd get told off for not doing that because it's dangerous, because you can cut your tongue and stuff like that. But it always made me laugh, and it's just something that springs to mind when I'm talking about these dishes. So the roast dinner is probably the most traditional. It was always really big, and there was always loads of food. And then if there were any leftovers, that would go into sandwiches or whatever we would have later on in the day. So that's Sunday. Monday, because the roast dinner always took a lot of time to cook. Oh, interesting. Going back to the roast dinner very, very quickly, jumping around a little bit. My granddad always used to carve it, and he had this really old electric carving knife. And I always found it really strange because I don't really know why he didn't just use a normal knife. But it was basically like a long plastic handle, and then it had, I think, 2 blades that were fitted into it, and they would basically go up and down, and it allowed you to cut the meat more easily. I don't know. And I always distinctly remember that was my granddad's job, and he would do that while we were setting the table and putting all the dishes out, and he would literally start carving it. And we had this tradition that he would always cut off the nubs, as he calls them, so the little end pieces or the little crispy bits, and he would put them to one side. And then when we came over, the 3 of us would always have those little bits, and he'd always save us some. So every time he was carving, we just gave him a few minutes, and then we could always go over there and have a little bit before we started. But on to Monday. Because the roast dinner was so laborious and time consuming, my nan would do something relatively simple on Monday, which was usually ham and chips or gammon and chips, depending on what type of pork that she had. And it would be usually with a fried egg for us. My nan couldn't have fried eggs because she had IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome. So she never had fried eggs because they just, as she said, they didn't agree with her, which means they would make her run to the toilet, obviously. So we would have that, maybe just some frozen chips and just some sliced gammon or ham or something like that with peas. So really, really simple, still, really nice, but nothing particularly crazy on that day. And Tuesday was spag bowl, as most British people call it, which is spaghetti bolognese. And for all the Italians watching, if you are Italian, I apologise. It's not actually spaghetti bolognese. It's not the traditional recipe. It's the British version, which is basically spaghetti with ragu. And also, it was cooked the British way, so the pasta wasn't added to the sauce afterwards and then mixed together. It was a big pile of spaghetti with the bolognese or the ragu on top. So it's, not authentic. Still tasted really good. It was my nan's recipe and not authentic Italian, but really, really tasty. The funny thing is, my mum was a terrible cook. When she did spaghetti bolognese, it was so bad. As a kid, I actually told her that I didn't like spaghetti because then she would cook me something different. It was usually something equally bad, but I really didn't want the spaghetti bolognese that she made. Then at a certain point, because I'd done that, I also then didn't have spaghetti at my nan's either, so she would actually make noodles, and then eventually I just tried the spaghetti and it was actually okay. But I think maybe I was so traumatized by the terrible cooking at home that I actually believed I didn't like spaghetti rather than the fact it was just the food was terrible. I don't know. But she would basically do it. It was usually beef mince and lots of tomatoes, and veg would go in there like onions and peppers and sometimes mushrooms. And then she would get an oxo cube. It's like a stock cube, and stock is the liquid produced when you boil bones or vegetables or something like that. So if you're making like a soup, you would boil down the bones to get that meat flavored water, and then you would add other stuff to it. Stock is basically that, and we have like a stock cube, which is a dried granulated version, which you normally put in boiling water, and it basically creates that stock for you. She would actually put that in there because it would like thicken it up and stuff like that. I don't really know, but it tasted pretty good, and she'd always get it simmering away, so the sauce was always really nice and thick, and we'd always have like parmesan we'd grate on the top and stuff like that. So it was really good. Occasionally we'd have garlic bread. Again, it was only for the 3 guys, so me, my brother and my granddad, because again, garlic was something else that didn't agree with my nana. But that was always really good, and I always looked forward to that one because there was always extra, so we were always fighting over who got the last couple of spoons of bolognese and stuff like that. So, another very delicious meal. Wednesday was usually shopping day. That's when my nan would go to Asda, which is a big supermarket here, and she would normally just pick up some frozen pizzas or some fresh pizzas, depending on what they had available. So it was a really simple dinner, literally just pizza, and that's it. So we would usually eat that in front of the telly, and it wasn't a big to-do. It was actually probably one of the most low-key meals we had, but when we were there, we actually got to pick the pizza. Otherwise, it was just frozen pizza, so nothing particularly special, but you knew what you were getting. If you were there on Wednesday, you were having a pizza. Thursday was always fish and chip day. My granddad, when he used to work, he would actually go out at lunchtime and pick them up on the way home, and we would always have fish and chips, and even when we weren't there, they would always do that themselves. Then when he retired, he would actually specifically go out at lunchtime to get them, and one of us would always go with him, so we always had the same thing. It was literally fish and chips. Obviously, the reason I mention that is because when you go to a fish and chip shop, you don't have to have fish, like battered cod. You can have sausages, you can have battered sausages. So the batter is the crispy stuff that you put around it that then is fried, and a batter is usually a mixture of flour and some liquid, and then it's usually used to fry or make pancakes. Is also used with batter. They also had a saveloy. I never really liked them. They were a sausage but in like a red skin, and you had to they were take the skin off, and they were boiled. They were always a bit weird. It never really my kind of thing. But they also had like pies and potato fritters and loads of other stuff like that. But we tended to go for the very basic fish, chips, and mushy peas. That was the very traditional order that we would always have. And my brother and I have very big appetites, so we would always have like a big adult portion, even from when we were pretty young. So it was quite expensive, I can imagine now, knowing the cost of food. But they did it every week, and it was amazing. And then Friday was the famous shepherd's pie. And I've mentioned this before. I actually have done a full episode where I talked about this recipe, because when we used to go out for the weekend, we would always have it in the evening, and they would actually delay their big meal of the day because we were coming up in the evening and we would have it with them there. And that was one of my absolute favourites, and it was always really big and filling and really warm. So especially in winter, it was something that was really amazing to look forward to. But yeah, if you want to hear more about that, go and check out that episode, because I go into loads and loads of detail about that recipe. But in a very simple way, it's basically beef mince or lamb mince, depending on what your recipe is, some vegetables, some gravy, and then mashed potato on top that you usually cook in the oven and then goes crispy. So really, really nice, and something very traditionally British. And finally, we're on Saturday, the final day of their menu, and it was always sausages. Usually with roast potatoes, even though thinking about it, I don't really know why we had roast potatoes when the next day we were having a roast dinner usually. But, you know, they always did. I think it was just that traditional meal of roast potatoes and sausages with some vegetables. But, you know, that's what we had. And they were always sausages from the butchers. The butchers, for anyone who doesn't know, is the person who prepares meat. So they cut it into the different types. They prepare sausages and burgers and all of that. So a butcher shop is the place where you go and you have all of the meat in the different forms and cuts laid out, and you can buy it fresh there. So rather than buying it from the supermarket, they would always buy really good quality sausages, proper bangers as we call them. So a banger in this case, not just used to talk about an amazing song, also used to talk about sausages in the UK. And they were really big, fat ones, usually Lincolnshire or Cumberland, because those were ones that always had really nice herbs and spices and stuff like that in. And my nan would buy like 30 or 40 at a time, and then she would freeze them. So I think like once a month she would buy them, and then in the freezer she would have these sausages on like a string, and they'd be all tied up, and then she'd separate them and freeze them in different bags. And then when we came, she would just pull out however many we were having. I think she'd pull out like 12 or maybe like 14, so there were a couple spare because we were always hungry. And usually it was just sausages cooked in the oven with some roast potatoes and then some peas or green vegetables. So again, really traditional, really simple, loads of gravy over the top, which is always one of my favourites. And that was also one of the meals where my granddad taught us another bad habit, which was going and getting a slice of bread when you finished, getting any leftover gravy, and basically soaking up all of the gravy in that sauce with a piece of bread and then eating it off the plate. We were told very early on when we were young that sort of thing is something that you can do at home, but you don't do it in a restaurant. After I actually once tried to do do it in a restaurant when I had gravy, and my nan lost her absolute mind because she thought that we were going to embarrass her or something like that. So obviously that's when I realised there are certain things that we do at home which we don't do in restaurants, which I guess is a good lesson to learn. Personally now, when I think about our food routine, I am not somebody who likes to be that regimented. It was always fun as a guest, but when I'm cooking, and when I say I'm cooking, my wife is the main chef in our house, and we do have a bit of a plan, but it tends to be very flexible, and it's usually that we will have the same thing for a couple of days and cook a big batch, especially with young kids. It tends to work out better that way. But it just always fills me with really happy memories thinking about those fixed menus and the things that we would have all the time, every time we were there. And even when we were there for like 2 weeks, we would literally have the same thing twice because you would just have the same thing on rotation. So really reliable, really consistent, and you always knew what you were getting. And they always had a saying that you never go to bed hungry. So even when we'd had 2 servings of spaghetti bolognese, or I'd had like 10 roast potatoes with my roast dinner, there was always some dessert or something extra, and I could always get more food, which, you know, maybe didn't help my waistline, but always meant I went to bed full and happy and I was never hungry, which is something that actually I've taken on and I think is really one of my mantras now, especially in my house, that I don't want anyone going hungry. That's it for this week, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this nostalgic trip into my Nana and Grandad's kitchen, and these things aren't just about food for me, they're really part of my heritage and my history, and a real testament to the warmth and love that was always at their table, and the sort of thing that I want to bring into my own house, especially for my boys. So make sure you check out these recipes and see what you think yourself. BBC Good Food is always a good place to try because they have some great recipes and you'll be able to find all of them there and maybe even try them out yourself. So see you next week for more culinary adventures and English learning, but until then, have a great time studying English and happy cooking.